The silver-gray light of a Seoul autumn always felt different to Mia than the humid, heavy mornings of Atlanta. Here, the air was crisp, smelling of toasted sesame oil and the cold stone of the nearby Gyeongbokgung Palace. At 50, Mia had curated a life of exquisite, intentional silence. Her apartment in Seoul was a study in minimalism. A single high-quality ceramic vase, a wall of books ranging from James Baldwin to Han Kang, and a view of the Bukhansan Mountains that looked like a scholar's ink wash painting. After 20 years of defending her tenure, her skin, and her sanity in the high-pressure cooker of American academia, she had retired to the one place where she could finally be a nobody. She was a tall woman, moving with a regal, slowed-down grace that made people in the bustling neighborhood unconsciously make way for her. She taught a single comparative literature class at a local community center, not for the money, but for the rhythm. It was during one of these walks, at a small, tucked-away cafe called Goyo's Silence, that she first felt his eyes. He was always there on Tuesdays. He sat in the far corner, a man who looked like he was carved from ice. He looked younger than her, perhaps in his early 40s, with hair clipped into a sharp military fade and suits that cost more than a year of Mia's pension. He never had a laptop. He never looked at a phone. He simply sat with a cup of black coffee and watched the world with a gaze so heavy it felt like a physical weight. On the third Tuesday, the cafe was crowded. A group of boisterous tourists had taken the center tables. Mia scanned the room, her brow furrowing slightly at the disruption of her sanctuary. The noise is an intruder today, isn't it? The voice was a low baritone, vibrating with an authority that wasn't raised, but felt. Mia turned. The man in the corner was looking at her. He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Please," he said. "The corner is the only fortress left." Mia hesitated, then sat. "Thank you, Mr. Han," he said, bowing his head just an inch. "Han Ji-hoon." "Mia," she replied, her Korean fluent but accented with the soft lilt of the American South. For a long moment, they simply sat in a shared, defensive silence against the noise of the room. Ji-hoon didn't perform the usual social gymnastics. He didn't ask where she was from or how long she'd been in Korea. He watched her the way an exhausted traveler watches a calm sea. "You have a very rare energy, Miyashi," he said finally. His eyes traced the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, not with judgment, but with envy. "You look like a woman who has finally stopped fighting." Mia took a slow sip of her tea, meeting his gaze. She saw the intensity people whispered about, the way his hands were scarred across the knuckles, the way his eyes never truly relaxed, scanning the door every time the bell chimed. He was a man made of jagged edges and hidden lightning. "I fought for a long time," Mia said softly. "I earned this peace. It's my most expensive possession." Ji-hoon leaned in, his shadow falling across the table. For a second, the air between them grew charged, a strange magnetism between the woman who had let go of everything and the man who was clearly holding on to too much. "I have spent my life acquiring things," Ji-hoon murmured, his voice dropping to a private frequency. "Power, territory, debt, but standing near you, I feel like I am standing in a garden after a war. It's captivating and very, very dangerous." Mia didn't flinch. She had stared down deans and bigots. She could handle a man who smelled of expensive cologne and unspoken violence. "Peace isn't a place you visit, Mr. Han," she said, gathering her things. "It's a choice you make every morning. Perhaps you should try choosing it sometime." As she stood to leave, Ji-hoon rose with her, a sudden, sharp movement that spoke of deep-seated habits of respect and protection. He watched her walk toward the door, his heart doing something it hadn't done in decades. It beat with curiosity instead of calculation. He was a man who owned half of the city's shadows, yet he found himself wondering what it would take to earn a seat in her garden. Days later, the transition from the sanctuary of the cafe to the jagged reality of the street happened in the span of a single heartbeat. Mia had been leaving the Goyo Cafe, her mind still humming with the strange magnetic weight of her conversation with Ji-hoon. The autumn air was turning sharp, and she pulled her wool wrap tighter around her shoulders. Ji-hoon was 3 paces behind her, his gait steady and silent, acting as an unasked-for escort to her bus stop. Then the world tilted. A black sedan, polished to a mirror finish, pulled to a silent screech at the curb. 2 more followed. In an instant, 6 men in identical charcoal suits spilled onto the sidewalk. They didn't move like bodyguards. They moved like a choreographed storm. Mia froze, her breath catching in the cold air. The men didn't reach for weapons. Instead, as one, they snapped their bodies into a rigid, 90-degree bow. The sound of their coordinated movement was like a whip cracking in the alleyway. "Boss!" they shouted in a terrifying unified roar. "The directors are waiting." The lead man, an older individual with a jagged scar running into his hairline, the one Mia would later know as Director Shin, stepped forward. He didn't look at Mia. To him, she was a ghost, a piece of irrelevant scenery. He kept his eyes on the pavement at Ji-hoon's feet. "The Kang family has breached the southern docks, Chairman," Shin said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "We need your word." Mia turned to look at the man she had just shared tea with. The Mr. Han, who had spoken of gardens and peace, was gone. In his place stood a statue of ice. His shoulders had broadened, his jaw was a blade, and his eyes, the eyes that had looked at her with such envy, were now flat and terrifyingly dark. He didn't look at the men. He looked at Mia. For 3 seconds, the silence was a vacuum. "Go," Mia whispered, the word tasting like ash. She didn't wait for his explanation. She turned and walked. She didn't run. Running was for the guilty or the afraid, and she was neither. But she moved with a sudden, icy purpose. The bow had revealed the truth. She hadn't found a man. She had found an empire. The rain began at dusk. It wasn't a gentle mist, but a relentless, freezing downpour that turned the Seoul streets into rivers of neon reflection. Inside her apartment, Mia sat in the dark. She didn't turn on the lamps. She watched the rain streak against her window, trying to reconcile the man who liked James Baldwin with the chairman who commanded a legion of shadows. She knew this world. She had seen its edges in the States, the way power consumed everything it touched until there was nothing left but bone. She had moved across the world to escape the violence of men. She would not let it back in. At 8 p.m., she looked out her window. He was there. Ji-hoon stood on the sidewalk across from her building. He had no umbrella. He wore the same suit from the cafe, now drenched and clinging to his frame. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't calling her phone. He simply stood there, a dark pillar in the deluge, his eyes fixed on her darkened balcony. At midnight, she checked again. He hadn't moved an inch. The street lights flickered, casting him in strobes of orange light. He looked less like a boss and more like a man doing penance. At 4 a.m., the temperature dropped. Mia's conscience finally overrode her caution. She couldn't let a man freeze to death on her doorstep, regardless of whose blood was on his hands. She descended the stairs, opened the heavy security door, and stepped into the cold. The rain immediately soaked through her sweater. He didn't move until she was 3 feet away. His skin was the color of marble, and his breath hitched in a ragged silver cloud. "Go home, Ji-hoon," she said, her voice trembling from the cold. "There is nothing for you here. I don't live in a world of directors and docs. I live in a world of books and silence. You'll destroy it just by standing in it." Ji-hoon took a step toward her. He didn't reach for her. He seemed to know his touch would be an intrusion. "I have spent 30 years being the weapon my father forged," he said, his voice cracked and hollow from the hours of cold. "Every day is a war. Every person I meet is a target or a threat. I am tired, Mia. I am so deeply, bone-wearily tired." "Then quit," she snapped. "I can't quit a bloodline, but when I sat across from you, for the first time in my life, the noise stopped. I wasn't a chairman. I wasn't a target. I was just a man." He looked up at the darkened sky, the rain lashing his face. "To the world, I must be a sword," he whispered, his eyes returning to hers with a desperate, burning clarity. "Cold, sharp, and bloodied. That is my function. But to you, Mia, to you, I only want to be the sheath. I want to be the place where the sword is put away. I want to be still. Please, don't take the silence away from me." Mia looked at him. This powerful, terrifying man reduced to a plea in the rain, and felt the iron in her chest begin to melt. She knew the danger. She knew the cost. But as she reached out a hand to touch his freezing sleeve, she knew she had already made the choice. "Come inside," she said, "before the sun comes up." The months that followed were a fever dream of stolen domesticity. In the quiet of Mia's apartment, the chairman was merely Ji-hoon, a man who liked his tea steeped for exactly 4 minutes, and who listened to Mia read poetry with a stillness that bordered on prayer. But outside those walls, the air was thickening with the scent of ozone before a storm. The deeper Ji-hoon fell into Mia's world of soft light and intellectual rigor, the more he felt the need to tether himself to it. He knew the fragility of his life. He knew that in his world, people didn't retire. They vanished. "I want to show you something," he said one Tuesday, his voice carrying a weight that signaled a shift. "Something from the old world, the way we keep what we cannot afford to lose." He took her to a part of Seoul that didn't appear on tourist maps, an industrial basement in Seongsu-dong, hidden behind a heavy steel door with no signage. Inside, the air smelled of green soap and antiseptic. The artist was an old man named Master O, whose hands were steady despite eyes that seemed to have seen a century of secrets. He didn't bow to Ji-hoon. He simply nodded and pointed to a table. "Are you sure?" Master O asked in a raspy dialect. "This is a life sentence, Ji-hoon." "I have never been more certain of anything," Ji-hoon replied. Mia watched, her heart hammering against her ribs, as Ji-hoon removed his shirt. She had seen his scars before, the jagged reminders of his rise to power. But now he was offering his skin as a canvas. He pulled a rolled vellum from his pocket and handed it to the artist. When Master O unrolled it, Mia gasped. It was a sketch Ji-hoon had commissioned from a photo he'd taken of her in the park. It wasn't just a likeness. It captured her essence. The regal tilt of her head, the depth of her gaze, the resilience in the set of her shoulders. "Ji-hoon, no," Mia whispered, stepping toward him. It's too much. The pain, the permanence." He reached out, taking her hand in his grip grounding and firm. "In my world, Mia, names are whispered and forgotten. Promises are broken before the ink is dry. But the things we mark on our bodies, those are the only truths that stay. No matter where I go, you will be with me. And no matter who I am facing, you will have my back." The session lasted 12 hours. Mia stayed for every minute of it, watching the needle rhythmically punctuate the silence. As the portrait of her face began to emerge across the broad expanse of his shoulders, she realized this wasn't just an act of love. It was an act of defiance. He was branding himself with his vulnerability. While the ink was still weeping on Ji-hoon's back, a different kind of poison was being brewed in a traditional Hanok estate on the outskirts of the city. Madame Kang, the matriarch of the Han Empire, sat behind a low table made of ancient cherry wood. At 74, she was a woman of terrifying elegance, her silver hair pulled back into a bun so tight it seemed to sharpen her features. Director Shin stood before her, his head bowed. He had just finished presenting a dossier. On the top of the pile was a photograph of Mia leaving her apartment. "A foreigner," Madame Kang said, her voice like the sliding of a blade into a scabbard, "and a woman of that age. He is not just distracted, Shin. He is delusional." "She is a former professor, Madame," Shin offered tentatively. "She has no ties to our rivals. She is a stain," the mother interrupted, her eyes snapping up, cold and dark. "My son is a king. A king does not seek peace in the arms of a woman who belongs to a world that doesn't understand the price of our blood. This is a sickness. He thinks he can wash the red from his hands by touching her." She picked up a delicate porcelain teacup and set it down with a sharp clack that echoed in the silent room. "Let him have his little rebellion for a moment," she murmured, her gaze returning to Mia's photo. "Men like Ji-hoon always return to their nature when they realize that peace is just a slow way to die. But if he doesn't, we will have to bleach this stain ourselves." She looked at Director Shin, a silent command passing between them. "Start the arrangements with the Kang family. If my son wants to play at being a man in love, we will remind him what it means to be a boss." The rain drummed a steady, hypnotic rhythm against the windows of Mia's apartment. Inside, the only light came from a single amber lamp and the soft glow of the heater. Ji-hoon sat on the floor, his back against the sofa, while Mia sat behind him. She was tracing the lines of the tattoo, the ink still fresh, the skin still sensitive. Her fingers moved with the lightness of a butterfly over the rendering of her own eyes on his shoulder blades. "It's a heavy thing to carry, Ji-hoon," she whispered. "My face, my history. Are you sure you want me there when you're walking into those rooms?" Ji-hoon leaned his head back, closing his eyes as he felt her touch. For a man who lived in a world of a constant physical threat, her touch was the only thing that didn't feel like a prelude to a blow. "I don't carry you for the world to see," he murmured, reaching back to find her hand and bringing it to his lips. "I carry you so that when I'm sitting in those rooms, surrounded by men who want my life, I can feel the warmth of your skin against my shirt. It reminds me that I'm not just a title. I'm a man who has a home to return to." He turned around, pulling her down to the floor with him. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, breathing in the scent of her and the faint, sharp tang of the tea she'd been drinking. "Promise me," he said, his voice muffled against her skin, "that no matter how loud the world gets, you'll listen for my voice. I will always come back to the silence." Mia held him, her fingers interlocking with his scarred ones. "I'll be here," she promised. The trap was set with the surgical precision that only decades of shared treachery could produce. Director Shin entered the chairman's office with a gait that suggested urgency, his face a practiced mask of loyal concern. "The Yamaguchi Gumi have crossed the line in Osaka, Chairman," he said, laying a series of falsified intelligence reports on the desk. "They're stalling the shipping routes, but their leadership has asked for a direct summit. No underbosses, only you." Ji-hoon looked at the documents, then at the clock. He had promised to take Mia to see the ginkgo trees at Deoksugung that evening. "Send the tactical team to scout first," he ordered. "With respect, sir, they've requested a tea of truce. If you send soldiers, it's a declaration of war. If you go alone, or with a minimal detail, we secure the trade routes for the next decade." Shin leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hum. "Do this, and you'll have the leverage to step back from the daily operations. You could have the life you want with her." It was the perfect lure, the promise of freedom, Ji-hoon agreed. He left that night, leaving a handwritten note under Mia's door. 3 days. Then the silence is ours. The moment the wheels of Ji-hoon's private jet left the tarmac, the shadow move began. Madame Kang's estate became a hive of quiet, lethal activity. She did not use guns or knives. She used the much more effective weaponry of social obligation and photographic evidence. She invited the daughter of the rival Kang clan, a young woman named Se-byul, whose family controlled the northern construction unions, to a public engagement luncheon. The press, carefully curated by Director Shin's payroll, was tipped off. "My son is a man of tradition," Madame Kang told the gathered reporters, her voice melodic and firm. She sat beside a blushing Se-byul, who had been told this was a settled matter. "This union represents the unification of Seoul. Ji-hoon is currently in Japan finalizing the dowry arrangements. We couldn't be more pleased." By the next morning, the headlines across every major Korean portal were inescapable. The Emperor of the Underworld finds his Empress. In her quiet apartment, Mia woke to the sound of her phone's constant vibration. It was a message from an unknown number, a link to the morning news. She stared at the screen. There was Ji-hoon's mother, radiant and triumphant. There was the beautiful young Korean heiress. And there were the leaked photos, staged by Shin's team weeks prior using a body double and clever angles, showing Ji-hoon and Se-byul entering a jewelry boutique in Tokyo. The air in the apartment felt suddenly thin, as if the oxygen had been sucked out. "It's a lie," Mia whispered to the empty room. Her hand went instinctively to her stomach. She had planned to tell him tonight. She was 6 weeks pregnant. Before she could process the betrayal, a knock sounded at her door. It wasn't the rhythmic, respectful knock of Ji-hoon. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of a man who didn't care if he was invited in. She opened the door to find Director Shin. He didn't step inside. He simply stood in the hallway, his presence a dark blot on her sanctuary. Behind him, 2 men in black suits blocked the stairs. "He didn't want to tell you himself," Shin said, his voice devoid of empathy. "Men like the chairman have needs that a woman of your background cannot fulfill. He has a duty to the bloodline. You are a pleasant autumn distraction, Mia-see, but winter has arrived." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. He held it out. "There is enough in here to get you back to America and live comfortably. If you are still in the city when he returns tomorrow, the mother will not be so generous, and neither will I." "He's in Japan for a peace treaty," Mia said, her voice trembling but her eyes hard. "He wouldn't do this." Shin smiled, a slow, ugly expression. "There is no peace treaty, Professor. There is only a wedding. Look at the news. He's marking his territory. You're just a footnote he forgot to erase." He dropped the envelope at her feet. As he turned to leave, he paused. "Oh, and the doctor you visited yesterday? The one who confirmed your condition? He works for us. A child from a woman like you is not a legacy. It's an inconvenience. Don't make us treat it like one." The door clicked shut. Mia stood in the silence of her minimalist home, the light of the Seoul skyline mocking her from the window. She realized then that Ji-hoon hadn't just been a sword. He was the center of a hurricane, and if she didn't run, the storm would swallow her and the tiny life flickering inside her. The silence in the apartment was no longer the goyo she had cherished. It was the silence of a tomb. Mia stood in the center of the room, her hand pressed flat against her lower abdomen. Just 48 hours ago, the positive result on the test strip had felt like a miracle. A bridge between her world and Ji-hoon's, a piece of life born from their shared stillness. Now, under the harsh glare of Director Shin's revelation, it felt like a bullseye painted on her skin. She looked down at the envelope Shin had dropped. It sat on her polished wood floor like a piece of filth. She forced herself to open it. Inside were more photos, grainy, long lens shots of her and Ji-hoon. But these were different. In one, Ji-hoon was laughing with director Shin, pointing toward her window with an expression of casual indifference. Pinned to the back was a typed transcript, purportedly a recording from the chairman's private club. "She's a curiosity, Shin," the text read, "a taste of something different before I settle into the real work. Once the Kang merger is set, send her back to the States with a nice pension. She served her purpose." The words were a physical blow. They tasted of iron. Mia knew, intellectually, that Shin was a master of fabrication. But the doubt, that ancient nagging whisper that told a woman of her age and her race that she was ultimately disposable, took root in the fertile soil of her fear. "A child from a woman like you is not a legacy," Shin's voice echoed in her mind. "It's an inconvenience." She looked at the portrait of the ginkgo trees on her wall. She thought of the tattoo on Ji-hoon's back, her own face, etched in ink and blood. Was it a mark of devotion or a trophy of a conquest? She couldn't risk the answer, not with a heartbeat that wasn't hers to gamble with. Mia moved with the cold, efficient speed of a survivor. She didn't pack her books. She didn't pack her fine ceramics. She took only her passport, her medicine, a thick wool coat, and the cash she had saved in a floorboard for emergencies. She left the cream-colored envelope on the kitchen table alongside the handwritten note Ji-hoon had left her. She placed her house key on top of them. She didn't head for Incheon Airport. She knew Shin's men would be watching the terminals, waiting to usher the foreign flavor out of the country. Instead, she walked 3 miles to the express bus terminal, her head low, a surgical mask hiding her face, a common enough sight in Seoul to render her invisible. She looked at the departures board. She didn't choose a city. She chose a direction, south, away from the steel and glass, away from the empires. 6 hours later, as the sun began to bleed over the jagged horizon of the Gyeongsang province, Mia stepped off a local shuttle into the village of Haho. Back in Seoul, 24 hours later, the heavy security door to Mia's apartment was kicked off its hinges. Ji-hoon charged in, his coat still damp from the Japanese rain, his heart thundering with a dread he couldn't name. He had seen the news of the engagement the moment he landed. He had ignored his mother's calls. He had come straight here to tell her it was a lie, to tell her he would burn the city down before he let a Kang woman near him. But the apartment was cold. He saw the key. He saw his own note. And he saw the envelope from Shin. He didn't need to open it to know what it contained. He looked at the empty space where her presence used to be, and a sound escaped him. A low, animal growl of grief that vibrated in the minimalist room. He turned to Director Shin, who stood in the doorway, his face a mask of feigned regret. "She took the money and left for the airport, Chairman," Shin lied smoothly. "She said she didn't want to be a footnote in your history." Ji-hoon didn't speak. He walked to the kitchen table and picked up the key. He squeezed it until the metal bit into his palm, drawing blood. "Find her," Ji-hoon whispered, his voice sounding like shifting tectonic plates. "Search every flight, every passenger list, every corner of the globe." He turned, his eyes glowing with a volcanic, terrifying light. "If she has left this country because of you, Shin, there won't be enough of you left for a funeral." The silence of the apartment was a physical assault. Ji-hoon stood in the center of the living room, the key still biting into the meat of his palm. He had expected a confrontation. Tears, perhaps, or the cold academic fury Mia used to dismantle illogical arguments. He had prepared 1,000 words to explain the treachery of his mother and the lies of the Kang family. But he had not prepared for nothing. The apartment was a hollow shell. Her scent, that faint, calming aroma of Earl Grey tea and expensive old paper books, was already being thinned out by the sterile draft from the hallway. He walked to the bedroom. The bed was made with military precision. The closet door stood open, revealing a row of empty hangers that rattled against one another like chattering teeth. He walked back to the kitchen table. He looked at the cream-colored envelope Director Shin had dropped. The payoff. Next to it lay the handwritten note he had left for her just 3 days ago. 3 days. Then the silence is hours. A dark, rhythmic pulse began to throb behind his eyes. In his world, when a person vanished, it was because they were taken. But the key sitting on top of the note told a more agonizing story. She had chosen to leave. She had looked at the life he offered, the blood-soaked peace of a mob boss, and she had handed it back. "Chairman," Director Shin's voice came from the doorway, oily and hushed. "The car is waiting. The board members are asking about the merger. We should secure the perimeter and—" Ji-hoon didn't turn around. His voice was a rasping ghost of itself. "Did she say anything?" "She was pragmatic, sir," Shin lied, his eyes fixed on the back of Ji-hoon's neck, where the collar of his shirt hid the tattoo of the woman he was currently burying. "She took the envelope. She said she was tired of the theater of Seoul. She wanted to return to a place where people look like her." The pulse in Ji-hoon's head became a roar. The betrayal of his mother, the manipulation of his empire, and the crushing absence of the only person who had ever seen him as a man instead of a weapon collided in his chest. He didn't scream. He didn't weep. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out his lighter, a heavy gold Zippo. He flicked it. The flame was a tiny dancing tongue of defiance in the gloom. He dropped it onto the silk curtains. "Sir!" Shin stepped forward, his eyes wide. "Let it burn," Ji-hoon commanded, his voice vibrating with a terrifying, nihilistic calm. "If she is not in this house, there is no house. If she is not in this life, there is no life." He walked out as his men scrambled to put out the fire. 2 weeks later, the ghost search began. Director Shin had played his hand perfectly. He knew that as long as Ji-hoon was in Korea, he would eventually smell the truth in the air. He needed the boss gone, distracted by the vastness of the world. "We tracked the passport usage, Chairman," Shin said, handing over a folder of fabricated flight manifests. "She didn't fly direct. She used a series of puddle jumpers. She's in New York, Harlem specifically. She has an aunt there." Ji-hoon looked at the photos, grainy, blurred shots of a tall black woman walking through a rainy Manhattan street. It wasn't Mia, but the height was right, the grace was similar, and Ji-hoon's desperation did the rest of the work. He arrived in New York during a brutal November cold snap. The boss of Seoul's most powerful syndicate spent his days walking the streets of Upper Manhattan, a ghost in a charcoal overcoat. He stood on street corners in the Bronx, showing a photograph to people who looked at him with suspicion and weariness. He sat in jazz clubs until 4 a.m, hoping to see her silhouette against the stage lights. He was a shark in a forest. He didn't speak the language well enough to catch the nuances, and the sheer scale of the city mocked him. Every time he saw a woman with Mia's posture, his heart would stop, only to shatter again when she turned around. He spent millions. He hired private investigators who took his money and gave him nothing. He haunted the corridors of Columbia University, thinking she might have returned to academia. One night, standing on the Brooklyn Bridge as the sleet turned into a punishing snow, Ji-hoon pulled up his collar. His back ached. The tattoo, the heavy ink of her face, felt like a lead weight stitched into his muscles. "Where are you?" he whispered into the wind. He was looking across an ocean, searching through millions of faces in a city of glass and steel. He was a world away from the truth. 3,000 miles to the east, in a quiet valley where the mountains leaned in to protect the secrets of the earth, Mia was sitting on a porch. She was watching a different snowfall, her hand resting on the life growing inside her. She wasn't a ghost in New York. She was a woman becoming the mountain. And Ji-hoon, blinded by the lies of the men he trusted, was searching for a shadow while the sun was rising in his own backyard. On her first day, the village of Haho did not welcome Mia. It merely endured her arrival. It was a place where time had been folded into the soil for 6 centuries. The Nakdong River curved around the village in a perfect S, a silver ribbon that seemed to keep the modern world at a distance. As Mia stepped off the rusted local bus, her single suitcase in hand, the silence was absolute. She was a tall, dark-skinned woman in a world of muted earthy tones and whitewashed plaster. The elderly men smoking long pipes on their porches went still. The women washing vegetables by the communal well froze. To them, she wasn't just a foreigner. She was an impossibility, a creature from a television screen who had stepped into their living history. Mia ignored the stares. She had been the first, or the only, in boardrooms and lecture halls across the West. She knew how to wear her dignity like armor. She found the cottage at the edge of the village, a humble structure with a thatched roof that smelled of damp straw and wood smoke. It belonged to the village matriarch, a woman everyone called Halmoni, grandmother. She was a tiny, bent woman whose face was as wrinkled as a dried plum, but her eyes were like polished flint. "I can pay," Mia said in her formal, careful Korean, holding out a small stack of bills. Halmoni didn't look at the money. She looked at Mia's hands. "You have the hands of a scholar," the old woman rasped, her voice like grinding stones. "Soft, useless for the harvest. Why are you here, Blackbird? To take photos of our poverty and leave." "I am here to disappear," Mia replied, "and to make sure my child is born in a place where the air doesn't taste of lies." Halmoni spat on the dirt path. "The air here tastes of hard work. If you stay, you eat what you grow. If you can't grow, you starve. We have no room for tourists." The test began the following morning. Halmoni did not give Mia a bed. She gave her a thin mat on a cold floor and a pile of garlic bulbs that needed peeling. Hundreds of them. Mia's fingers bled. The stinging juice seeped into her skin, but she didn't utter a word. She worked until her back screamed and her vision blurred. But the real challenge came from the village school. The Haho Elementary School was a dying heart. With only 12 students left, the government was threatening to consolidate it with a larger school 2 hours away. The children were listless, and the curriculum was a dusty relic of the 1980s. The village elders were in despair. If the school closed, the village would lose its soul. Halmoni, who served as the unofficial chair of the village council, brought Mia to the schoolhouse. "You say you are a professor?" Halmoni challenged, gesturing to the 3-room building. "These children are falling behind. If they cannot pass the regional exams, the school dies. Show me your wisdom, scholar." Mia stepped into the classroom. The children stared at her, wide-eyed and terrified. She didn't start with English or mathematics. She walked to the chalkboard and drew a map, not of Korea, but of the river that hugged their village. "The river moves," Mia told them, her voice low and resonant. "It brings new things, and it carries away the old. But the banks stay. You are the banks. You must be strong enough to hold the water." Over the next month, Mia transformed the school. She stayed up until dawn, rewriting the curriculum to blend traditional Korean history with global geography and literature. She taught the children to see their village not as a backwater, but as a masterpiece. She used the village's own mask dancing traditions to teach them about theater and psychology. She taught them English through the lyrics of soul music, their young voices rising in the valley, singing about hope and change. The transformation was undeniable. The children who had been silent began to ask questions that stumped their parents. The regional inspectors, who had come to sign the closure papers, found a classroom of students who could discuss the Silk Road and the Nakdong River in the same breath. On a Tuesday evening, a month after her arrival, Mia returned to Halmoni's cottage. She found a bowl of steaming doenjang jjigae, soybean paste stew, and a fresh, thick silk quilt waiting on her mat. Halmoni was sitting on the porch, her flinty eyes softened by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp. She didn't look up as Mia approached. "The school stays open," Halmoni said quietly. "The children, they look at the world differently now. They aren't afraid of the horizon." She finally looked at Mia, her gaze lingering on the slight swell of Mia's belly. "You aren't a blackbird anymore," the old woman murmured, gesturing for Mia to sit and eat. "You are a daughter of Haho. Eat. The child needs to be strong if he is to carry the weight of two worlds." Mia sat, the steam from the stew warming her face. For the first time since she had left Seoul, the crushing weight in her chest eased. She was no longer a ghost or a foreign flavor. She was a root, digging deep into the ancient earth, preparing for the winter. The sky over the Gyeongsang province didn't just darken, it bruised. A late spring typhoon, premature and violent, clawed its way up the peninsula, screaming through the mountain passes and turning the Nakdong River into a churning throat of mud. Inside the small cottage, Mia was losing her sense of time. The contractions were no longer waves. They were a continuous white-hot jaggedness that threatened to tear her in two. She lay on the yellowed hanji floor paper, her fingers digging into the silk quilt Halmoni had given her. Sweat slicked her skin, turning her dark shoulders into polished onyx in the flickering candlelight. "Breathe, blackbird," Halmoni commanded, though her own voice was strained against the howl of the wind rattling the roof tiles. The village power had flickered out hours ago. Then the door creaked open. One by one, the women of Haho entered. They didn't come with medical kits. They came with bowls of warm water, clean linen, and an ancestral stoicism. These were women who had birthed children in fields, during wars, and through winters that froze the marrow. They didn't stand back. They formed a physical circle around her, a wall of floral print aprons and weathered skin. One woman, the mother of her brightest student, took Mia's hand, her grip like iron. Another pressed a cool, damp cloth to Mia's forehead. The storm peaked. A thunderclap shook the very foundation of the cottage, and Mia let out a primal scream that was swallowed by the gale. In that moment of absolute agony, she felt the circle tighten. The women began a low, rhythmic chant, half prayer, half humming, a vibration that seemed to anchor her to the earth. They weren't just watching her. They were pulling the life out of her with the collective strength of their own histories. "Now!" Halmoni barked. With a final, shattering effort, the world seemed to go silent. The wind died for a heartbeat, and in that vacuum, a sharp, thin cry pierced the room. Halmoni held the child, a boy with a shock of dark hair and skin the color of toasted almond. She cleaned him with practiced hands and laid him on Mia's exhausted chest. "June," Mia whispered, her voice a thread. "His name is June." The women of the circle exhaled as one, their faces softening. Outside, the rain began to transition from a roar to a steady, life-giving rhythm. The foreigner's son had arrived, and the mountains had let him stay. 300 miles to the north, in the sterile, neon-lit heart of Seoul, a different kind of storm was breaking. The grand ballroom of the Shilla Hotel was a sea of black ties and silk handboks. It was the night of the Unification Banquet, the event designed by Madame Kang and Director Shin to finalize the merger between the Han and Kang empires. Sae-Byul, the rival daughter, stood on the dais, a vision of obedient beauty, waiting for the man who would solidify her family's power. The double door swung open. Ji-hoon entered. He didn't wear a tuxedo. He wore a simple, dark suit, his face a mask of such profound coldness that the room's temperature seemed to drop. He didn't walk to the dais. He walked to the center of the floor, standing beneath a crystal chandelier that looked like a cluster of falling daggers. "Chairman," Director Shin whispered, stepping forward with a forced smile. "The priest is ready for the blessing. The contract is on the table." Ji-hoon didn't look at Shin. He looked at his mother, who sat in the front row like a queen on a chessboard. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a fountain pen, the one his father had used to sign the treaties of the old world. He didn't sign the contract. He snapped the pen in half. The black ink sprayed across the white linen of the table, looking like a fresh wound. A collective gasp rippled through the room. "There will be no marriage," Ji-hoon said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried to every corner of the silent hall. "There will be no merger." "Ji-hoon!" Madame Kang stood, her face pale with fury. "You are shaming the ancestors. You are declaring war." "Then let it be war," Ji-hoon replied, his eyes burning with the memory of an empty apartment and a lost peace. "I have already lost the only thing that made this empire worth ruling. You can keep the dirt and the docks, but you will not keep me." He turned his back on the most powerful people in Korea. As he walked out, the silence he left behind was the beginning of a cold war. The Kang family began to murmur. The directors began to choose sides. The underworld was fracturing, and the sword of Seoul was finally beginning to rust by design. As he stepped into the cool night air, he felt a strange, sharp tingle in the skin of his back, right where the ink of Mia's face was etched. He didn't know that at that exact moment, a boy named June was taking his first breath. He only knew that for the first time in his life, he was truly dangerously alone. The passage of 3 years in the village of Haho was marked not by the ticking of a clock, but by the deepening of the river's curve and the height of the corn in the valley. Mia had become a fixture of the landscape, as essential as the mountain itself. She was no longer the foreigner. She was Mia Seonseong-nim. Teacher Mia. She moved through the village with a basket on her arm, her Korean now salted with the earthy, rolling dialect of the elders. She had traded her silk wraps for sturdy linen, and her regal grace had hardened into something more durable, a quiet, unbreakable strength. But it was the child at her hip who drew the most whispers. June, at 3 years old, was a hauntingly beautiful anomaly. He had his mother's deep, soulful coloring, but his features were a devastating mirror of a man 300 miles away. He had the Han jawline, a sharp, noble blade, and eyes that were far too old for his face. Most toddlers in the village were a whirlwind of noise and sticky fingers. June was different. He was eerily, profoundly quiet. He would sit for hours on the wooden porch of their cottage, not playing with wooden trucks, but watching the way the wind moved through the tall grass. He observed people with a terrifyingly precise intensity, his head tilted as if he were decoding their very thoughts. "He doesn't play," Halmoni would grumble, though she now looked at the boy with a fierce, grandmotherly devotion. "He calculates. Look at him, Mia. He's not looking at the birds. He's watching the patterns of their flight. He has a general's eyes." Mia would watch her son and feel a cold shiver of recognition. When June did speak, it was with a startling economy of words. He didn't ask for things. He stated observations. He had a way of standing, hands behind his back, feet planted firm, that made the village elders unconsciously straighten their own postures. He was a prince in a peasant's valley, a lion cub raised by a gazelle. In Seoul, the living ghost moved through a world of glass and shadows. Ji-hoon had won the Cold War, but the victory was Pyrrhic. He had consolidated power until no one dared whisper a word of dissent, but he ruled over an empire of ash. He had become more ruthless, more efficient, and entirely hollow. He lived in a penthouse that was a temple of cold marble and silent air. He never brought guests there. He never married. The Kong family had been systematically dismantled, not through violence, but through a series of surgical financial strikes that left them destitute and humiliated. He had settled the score for the shadow move, but it brought him no peace. To his men, he was a myth. He rarely spoke, communicating through brief, icy nods. He worked 18 hours a day, burying himself in the logistics of shipping, construction, and the cleaning of the family legacy. But at night, the armor came off. Ji-hoon would stand before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in his dressing room and remove his shirt. He would turn his back to the glass, using a hand mirror to look at the ink. The portrait of Mia was still vibrant, though the skin around it bore the faint white lines of new scars from 3 years of narrow escapes and boardroom battles. He would trace the line of her jaw in the reflection, his fingers trembling. She was the only thing in the world he couldn't buy, find, or conquer. He had sent men to every corner of the globe. He had hired hackers to scrub the digital footprints of every Mia in existence. He had spent a fortune chasing ghosts in New York, London, and Paris. He didn't know that every time he looked at the mountains from his office window, he was looking in her direction. "Chairman," Director Shin's voice came through the intercom. Shin had survived the purges, but he was a broken man, kept around only because Ji-hoon found a cruel satisfaction in watching his former mentor wither in the shadow of the man he had tried to manipulate. "The quarterly reports are ready." "Leave them," Ji-hoon said, his voice a deadened rasp. He put his shirt back on, buttoning the collar high to hide the woman on his skin. He stepped out onto his balcony, looking down at the glittering, heartless lights of Seoul. He was the most powerful man in the country, and he would have traded every skyscraper he owned for 1 hour in the silence he had lost. He felt the phantom weight of a child he didn't know existed. A pull toward a south he had convinced himself held nothing but memories. The sky over the valley was a bruised purple, heavy with the threat of a summer storm that refused to break. Ji-hoon sat in the back of the black sedan, his eyes closed, the rhythmic hum of the engine, the only thing keeping the pounding in his temples at bay. He was returning from a grueling inspection of a new shipyard in Ulsan, taking the back roads to avoid the glare of the highway. He wanted the shadows. He wanted the trees. Then the hum became a stutter. A metallic grind echoed through the chassis, and the car lurched to a halt on a narrow, winding road flanked by ancient pines. "Chairman, I am deeply sorry," the driver stammered, his face pale as he checked the dashboard. "The radiator. It seems a stone must have pierced it. I'll call for a backup vehicle immediately." Ji-hoon opened his eyes. The air here was still, thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. He looked out the window. "How long?" "At least an hour, sir. We are quite far from the main city." Ji-hoon pushed the door open. The silence of the countryside rushed in, nearly deafening after the roar of Seoul. "I'll walk. There's a settlement a few hundred meters back." "Sir, it's not safe." "I am a man, Sang-min, not a delicate porcelain vase," Ji-hoon snapped, though there was no heat in it, only a profound exhaustion. "Stay with the car." He walked alone, his handmade Italian shoes crunching on the gravel. He rounded a bend and saw it. A small roadside market, its wooden frame weathered to a silver gray. A sign above the door read, "Goyo Sangjom." The Shop of Silence. Ji-hoon paused, the name pulling at a memory of a cafe in Seoul that felt like it belonged to a different life. He stepped inside. A small bell chimed. The shop was dim, smelling of dried roots, fermented soy, and something sweet, like sun-warmed peaches. It was empty of people, but full of life. He walked to the cooler in the corner, his movements stiff. He pulled out a bottle of water, the plastic cold against his palm. Behind the counter was a sliding honji door, a frame of light wood and translucent paper. From behind it, someone was humming a low, soulful melody, the kind of song that didn't belong in the mountains of Korea. Ji-hoon took a step toward the paper door. His hand reached out, his fingers trembling as they hovered inches from the delicate lattice. The paper was so thin he could see a silhouette on the other side, a tall, graceful curve of a shoulder, the tilt of a head. "Mia?" his soul screamed, but his throat was locked. Just as his fingertips brushed the paper, the shop's front door swung open. A group of local farmers entered, boisterous and loud, complaining about the heat and the coming rain. The spell was shattered. The humming behind the door stopped. Ji-hoon recoiled, his mask of the living ghost slamming back into place. He couldn't do it. If he opened that door and it wasn't her, the small thread of hope that kept him breathing would snap. He hurried to the counter. He didn't wait for the shopkeeper. He pulled out a 50,000 won note, far too much for a bottle of water. He left the money on the counter and bolted out the door, disappearing into the gray light just as the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. A minute later, the sliding hanji door creaked open. Mia stepped out, wiping her sudsy hands on her apron. Little June followed her, clutching a wooden tiger, his dark eyes instantly scanning the room. "The bell rang, Mommy," June said, his voice quiet and precise. "I know, baby. I think they left." Mia walked to the counter. She saw the 50,000 won note and frowned. Someone was very hurried, or very generous. 6 years had passed since the 50,000 won note and a bottle of water. And the valley of Haho had shaped June into something formidable. At 9 years old, he was no longer just the quiet boy. He was the village's hidden treasure. While other children played tag in the dirt, June spent his afternoon sitting with the village elders, playing Baduk, Go. He didn't just play, he dismantled them. He saw the board not as a game, but as a series of inevitable conclusions. Mia watched him with a mixture of pride and a gnawing, persistent dread. She had tried to keep him small, to keep him contained within the protective embrace of the mountains. But June was like a flood. He couldn't be held back by sandbags. "Mommy, it's just a test," June said, adjusting the collar of his stiff school shirt. He stood in the kitchen of their cottage, his posture perfectly erect, his dark eyes calm. "It's a national competition, June. People will be there. Cameras," Mia said, her voice tight as she smoothed his hair. "I won't let them see me if you don't want them to," he replied, his voice carrying that eerie, adult-like intuition. "But the school needs the prize money, and I want to win." He did more than win. The National Mathematics and Strategic Logic Competition in Andong was supposed to be a showcase for the elite private academy students from Seoul. Instead, it became a massacre. June sat at the center of the hall, a boy of mixed heritage in a sea of uniform black hair, his mind moving at speeds the judges couldn't quite track. He solved problems that were meant for high schoolers, his hand moving across the paper with a sharp, aggressive precision. But when the final results were announced, the room went silent. A scholarship student from a village no one had heard of had taken the grand prize. The next morning, the Gyeongsang Ilbo ran a feature on the genius of the valley. The photo was a half-page spread, June standing on the podium, holding his trophy. He wasn't smiling. He was looking directly into the lens with a flat, piercing gaze, the kind of look that seemed to see through the camera and into the person holding it. In a smoky, dimly lit office in Seoul's Gangnam district, Mr. Park, Ji-hoon's most trusted associate and the man who managed the untraceable assets, was enjoying a rare moment of quiet. He flipped through the regional papers, looking for land development leads, when he reached the education section. He froze. His cigarette ash fell unheeded onto his silk tie. He pulled the paper closer to his face, his eyes narrowing. He wasn't looking at the boy's skin color, or the trophy, or the rural school banner in the background. He was looking at the eyes. The Han eyes were legendary in the underworld. They were a specific hooded shape, sharp at the inner corner, slightly tilted, with a gaze that felt like it was pressing against your chest. It was the look Ji-hoon's father had used to terrify his enemies, and the look Ji-hoon used to command his empire. "No," Park whispered, his heart beginning to thrum a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "It's impossible." He stood up and walked to the wall, safe, pulling out a folder that hadn't been touched in years. Inside was a photograph from the original search, the one Ji-hoon had never seen. It was a surveillance shot of Mia leaving her doctor's office in Seoul 9 years ago. She had been touching her stomach. Park compared the photo of the woman to the boy in the newspaper. Then he looked at a photo of a young Ji-hoon from the 1980s. The lineage was written in the bone. It was in the bridge of the nose, the set of the mouth, and that unmistakable, predatory intelligence in the eyes. Park sat back, the newspaper trembling in his hand. He remembered the night the chairman had burned the apartment. He remembered the 6 years of living ghost silence. He knew that Director Shin had lied. He knew that the woman on the chairman's back wasn't a ghost in New York. She was a mother in the mountains. He looked at the caption, June, Grade 3, Haho Elementary. 3 hours away, Park breathed, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. For 6 years, the chairman had been searching the world. He had spent billions chasing shadows in foreign cities, while his heart and his legacy were a short drive from the city limits. Park looked at the phone on his desk. He could call Director Shin, but Shin would kill the boy to protect the lie. He could call the mother, but she would steal the boy and discard the mother. He picked up his private burner phone. He dialed the one number that bypassed every secretary, every guard, and every filter. "Chairman," Park said when the line clicked open. His voice was steady, but his hand was white-knuckled. "I don't need to meet with you about the docs. I need to meet with you about the tattoo. I think the ink is breathing." The drive from Seoul to the Gyeongsang province felt like a journey through time, the sleek, silver-gray skyline of the capital dissolving into the jagged, ancient greens of the interior. Mr. Park drove his own car, an unassuming SUV that wouldn't draw the eyes of the chairman's security detail or Director Shin's watchers. He arrived in Haho as the afternoon sun was beginning to dip behind the peaks, casting long, dramatic shadows over the river. He didn't go to the school. He didn't want to be seen by officials. He parked on the outskirts and walked, his city-bred nerves twitching at the sheer, heavy silence of the valley. He found the cottage at the edge of the village. It was a modest place, but the garden was meticulously kept, rows of kale, peppers, and medicinal herbs that spoke of a disciplined life. And then he saw her. Mia was standing in the yard, hanging laundry. She was older, the silver at her temples catching the dying light, but she moved with that same regal, rhythmic grace Park remembered from the surveillance photos. She looked like a queen who had chosen the life of a monk. A boy? June ran out of the house, clutching a book. He said something in rapid-fire Korean, and Mia laughed. It was a sound Park had never heard in the city, rich, genuine, and free. Mia reached down, ruffling the boy's hair, and for a second, they both turned toward the road. Park ducked behind a stone wall, his breath coming in shallow hitches. Seeing them in the newspaper was one thing. Seeing them in the flesh was a spiritual collision. The boy didn't just look like Ji-hoon. He was Ji-hoon, stripped of the scars and the cynicism. Park leaned back against the cold stone, closing his eyes. He remembered a night 5 years ago in a private sauna when the chairman had fallen asleep from sheer exhaustion. The towel had slipped, revealing the full expanse of his back. Park had stared, mesmerized, at the portrait. The ink had been so detailed he could see the light in the woman's eyes. He looked back toward the cottage. It was the same woman, the same eyes. God help us, Park whispered. He didn't return to his office. He didn't go to the syndicate's headquarters. He drove straight to the penthouse. Ji-hoon was in his study, a room of dark mahogany that felt more like a vault. He was staring at a map of the Busan port, a glass of untouched whiskey at his elbow. He didn't look up when Park entered, an unheard-of breach of protocol. I told Shin I wasn't to be disturbed, Park, Ji-hoon said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. I didn't ask Shin's permission, Chairman, Park said. He walked to the desk and laid the regional newspaper down. He placed a second item on top of it, a small, handheld magnifying glass. Ji-hoon's gaze drifted to the paper. He saw the boy. He saw the trophy. At first, there was no recognition, only the mild curiosity of a man looking at a talented stranger. Then he looked at the eyes. The glass of whiskey shattered. It didn't fall. Ji-hoon's hand simply tightened until the crystal gave way, the amber liquid mixing with the blood from his palm. He didn't seem to feel it. Where? Ji-hoon asked. The word wasn't a question. It was a demand for the coordinates of his soul. Haho, 3 hours south, Park replied. She's been there the whole time, sir. She's a teacher. The boy, his name is June. He's 9 years old. Ji-hoon stood up, the shards of glass falling to the carpet. He looked at Park, and for the first time in nearly a decade, the living ghost was gone. In his eyes was a fire so bright it was agonizing to look at. It was the look of a man who had just been told he was no longer dead. Shin told me she went to America, Ji-hoon said, his voice trembling with a nascent, terrifying rage. My mother told me she was a footnote. They lied, Chairman, to both of you. Ji-hoon walked to the window, looking out over the city he had conquered, but never loved. He thought of the 9 years of winter. He thought of the tattoo on his back, the woman who had been 3 hours away while he searched the world. Get the car, Ji-hoon commanded. Sir, should I call the security detail? Should we alert the local police? Ji-hoon turned, his face a mask of predatory focus. No detail, no Shin, no mother, just you and me. I'm going to see my son. He paused, his hand going to the back of his neck, touching the edge of the ink beneath his collar. And then, he added, his voice dropping to a whisper that promised a reckoning, I am going to burn down the world that kept us apart. The silver-gray sedan didn't stop at the village gate. Ji-hoon had parked the car a kilometer away, tucked into a grove of weeping willows. He approached Haho on foot, dressed not in his bespoke armor of Italian wool, but in a simple black windbreaker and a cap pulled low. He moved through the shadows of the ancient stone walls like a predator, returning to a territory he had never known he owned. For 48 hours, Ji-hoon became a ghost. He did not approach. He did not call out. He perched in the high branches of an ancient ginkgo tree overlooking the schoolyard, and he sat on the dark ridge of the mountain behind Mia's cottage, watching through high-powered binoculars that felt like lead in his hands. He watched Mia first. He expected to find a woman broken by the weight of her exile. Instead, he found a titan. He watched her lead the village children, her voice carrying across the yard, firm, melodic, and commanding a respect that wasn't born of fear, but of love. He saw her hoist a heavy basket of wet laundry with a strength that made his own muscles ache in sympathy. He watched her negotiate with a local farmer over the price of coal, her chin tilted at that same regal angle that had first captivated him in a Seoul cafe. She wasn't surviving, she was reigning. But it was the second day, at the village pavilion, that broke the living ghost entirely. June sat cross-legged on the wooden floor, surrounded by 3 of the village's oldest men. In the center of the circle was a badak board. The elders were leaning in, their faces etched with the concentration usually reserved for life or death matters. Ji-hoon watched through the glass. He saw his son, his own jawline, his own brow, staring at the black and white stones. June didn't fidget. He didn't look up. He sat with a stillness that Ji-hoon recognized with a jolt of visceral terror. It was the stillness of a strategist. It was the Han stillness. June reached out, his small fingers placing a black stone with a sharp, decisive clack. One of the elders slumped back, throwing his hands up in a gesture of amused defeat. The boy didn't gloat. He simply bowed his head, a gesture of profound, innate grace, and began to clear the board. Ji-hoon lowered the binoculars, his breath hitching in the cold mountain air. A tear, hot and unbidden, tracked a path through the dust on his cheek. He hadn't just lost a woman to a lie. He hadn't just lost a decade of his life to a search for a phantom. He saw June's hands. Steady, capable, and terrifyingly brilliant, and realized he had lost a legacy. He had been a king without an heir, a sword without a smith, while the greatest treasure of his bloodline had been playing games in the dirt 3 hours away. The weight of the tattoo on his back felt like it was burning through his clothes. The woman on his skin was a living person. The child he had never held was a genius who carried his father's fire. 48 hours, Park whispered, appearing behind him on the mountain path. The sun is setting, Chairman. What is the order? Ji-hoon didn't look back. He watched as Mia walked toward the pavilion, her hand reaching out to catch June's shoulder. He watched the boy look up at her with a smile that Ji-hoon had never been allowed to receive. The order is over, Ji-hoon said, his voice a jagged rasp of iron and grief. I am done watching. He stepped out from the shadow of the trees, the black windbreaker rustling. He began to descend the mountain, moving toward the lights of the village. He wasn't walking like a boss. He was walking like a man going to reclaim his soul from the wreckage of a 10-year lie. The sun had dipped below the ridges, leaving the valley in a bruised violet twilight. Inside the cottage, the air smelled of scorched garlic and pine smoke. Mia was at the counter, her back to the open door, rhythmically dicing vegetables for dinner. The steady thwack-thwack of the blade was the only sound until the floorboard on the porch groaned. It wasn't the light step of a neighbor. It was a heavy, deliberate weight that displaced the very air in the room. Mia froze. The knife stayed pinned to the cutting board. She didn't need to turn around. The scent of his cologne and cold rain, a scent she had spent 9 years trying to scrub from her memory, flooded the small kitchen. You're late for the bus, Mr. Han, she said, her voice a low, dangerous vibration. I didn't take the bus, Ji-hoon replied. He stood in the doorway, a shadow framed by the dying light. He looked older, his face etched with a hardness that made him look like a monument to grief. But his eyes, those predatory, Han-style eyes, were wet. Mia turned. In one fluid motion, she didn't reach for him or scream. She raised the heavy cleaver, her knuckles white as she pointed the steel at his chest. Stay! Right! There! Ji-hoon stopped. He looked at the knife, then at her. Mia, he whispered, the name sounding like a prayer he'd forgotten how to say. Don't use my name, she spat, her Korean sharpening into the jagged dialect of a woman who had fought for every inch of her peace. You have no place here. This isn't your territory. This isn't a dock or a boardroom. This is my home. Get out before I show you exactly what I learned from living in the dirt you threw me into. I didn't throw you anywhere, Ji-hoon said, taking a tentative step forward. The knife point brushed the fabric of his jacket, right over his heart. I searched for you. For 9 years, Mia. I went to New York. I went to London, Shin told me you took the money. He showed me the flight records. Shin? Mia's laugh was a jagged, ugly thing. You're blaming the dog you keep on a leash? Shin followed me to my door. He showed me the photos of you and the Kang girl. He played the recordings of you calling me a foreign flavor. He threatened my son's life before he was even born. Ji-hoon went perfectly still. The living ghost mask didn't just crack, it disintegrated. The realization of the scope of the lie, the systematic, decade-long erasure of his life by the people he called family, hit him with the force of a physical blow. Recordings? He asked, his voice breaking. Mia, I almost started a war to avoid that marriage. I burned our apartment to the ground because I couldn't stand the silence of you being gone. He reached for the collar of his shirt, his fingers fumbling with the buttons. He yanked the fabric down, baring his back to her. In the dim light of the kitchen, the tattoo was a masterpiece of agony. Her own face, weathered by his skin but preserved in his ink, stared back at her. It was scarred. It was aged by the years he had spent fighting, but it was there, at the center of his being. I carried you, he choked out, turning back to face her, his eyes wild. Every day, every bullet I dodged, every man I broke. I did it because I thought if I reached the top, I'd have the power to find you. And you were here. You were here the whole time. The knife in Mia's hand wavered. The volcanic rage in her chest met the cold reality of his grief, and for a second, the room felt like it might explode from the pressure. I don't care about your back, she whispered, though her eyes were fixed on the ink. I care about the 9 years my son spent without a father because you were too blind to see the vipers in your own house. Mommy? The voice was small, clear, and terrifyingly calm. Both of them turned. June was standing in the shadows of the hallway, his school bag still over one shoulder. He wasn't crying. He wasn't hidden. He was observing. He looked at the tall man in the expensive jacket, then at the knife in his mother's hand, then back to the man's face. June walked forward, his gait a perfect, chilling echo of Ji-hoon's. He stopped 3 feet from his father. He tilted his head, his dark eyes scanning Ji-hoon's features with the precision of a jeweler. June, go to your room, Mia said, her voice trembling. The boy didn't move. He kept his eyes locked on Ji-hoon. You're the man from the drawing, June said quietly. Ji-hoon dropped to his knees, not caring about the dust or his dignity. He was eye level with the boy, with his own reflection. What drawing, son? June didn't flinch at the word son. The one Mommy keeps under her pillow. The one she thinks I don't see. She draws you when she thinks I'm sleeping. But she always draws you with a smile. June reached out, his small, steady hand hovering near Ji-hoon's face. You don't look like the drawing, the boy observed, his voice devoid of judgment but heavy with truth. You look like you've been in a war. Ji-hoon let out a jagged sob, reaching out to catch the boy's hand. The sword of Seoul finally broke, his forehead resting against his son's small palm, while Mia stood above them, the kitchen knife finally lowering as the past and the present collided in the quiet mountain air. The storm that had been brewing in the mountains finally broke, but inside the cottage, the air was unnervingly still. June had fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep in the small side room, leaving Mia and Ji-hoon alone in the kitchen. The kitchen knife lay abandoned on the wooden table, a silent witness to the collision of 2 lives. Ji-hoon sat on a low stool, his broad shoulders hunched as if he were trying to shrink into the shadows. He looked at his hands, the hands that had built an empire and broken men, and saw only the dust of the village. I didn't come with just a plea, Mia, he said, his voice a low, rough rasp. He reached into the heavy black bag Park had brought to the gate. He pulled out a leather-bound volume, its edges frayed and its pages smelling of old safes and expensive corruption. Beside it, He laid a stack of ivory stationery, his mother's personal letters, embossed with the Han family seal. "This is the Black Ledger," Ji-hoon whispered. "It's the soul of the organization. Shin thought he had buried it when he cleaned the books after you left. He didn't realize I've been keeping my own tally for 9 years." Mia didn't touch the book at first. She looked at the letters. She recognized the elegant, sharp calligraphy of Madame Kong, the woman who had looked her in the eye and told her she was a temporary season. "Read them," Ji-hoon urged. Mia pulled the first letter toward her. It was dated 1 week after she had vanished into the mountains. To Director Shin, "The foreign infection has been excised. Ensure the bank transfers to the American accounts are falsified. My son must believe she took the price of a queen to leave him. If he suspects the child must be treated as a threat to the succession. Use the Kang girl as a shield. Let him hate the woman he loved. Hate is a better motivator than grief." Mia's hand shook, the paper rattling in her grip. The room seemed to tilt. "Falsified bank transfers?" she whispered. "Ji-hoon, I never touched a cent of that money. I left it on the table." "I know that," he said, his eyes burning with a dark, concentrated fury. "But Shin showed me the signed receipts. He showed me the bank logs from Atlanta. He made it look like you had sold me before you even reached the airport. He spent millions of the company's money to create a paper trail of your greed." Mia opened the ledger. Her academic mind, trained to find patterns in chaos, quickly decoded the columns. There were payments to private investigators in New York, the very men Ji-hoon had hired, who were actually on Shin's payroll, sent to lead him toward dead ends and near misses across the Atlantic. "He used my own obsession against me," Ji-hoon said, his voice cracking. "He kept me searching the world so I wouldn't look in my own backyard. He and my mother, they weren't just protecting the bloodline, Mia. They were protecting their own power. As long as I was a living ghost, chasing a shadow in Harlem, Shin was the one actually running Seoul. I was the figurehead. He was the king." Pow! The realization hit them both like a physical weight. They weren't just victims of a misunderstanding. They were the architects of a 10-year masterpiece of manipulation. Mia looked at the ledger, then at the man across from her. She saw the lines of age on his face, the scars on his knuckles, and the absolute hollow in his gaze. She thought of her own years of isolation, the cold nights in the village, the fear of every black car that passed, the way she had raised June to be a ghost because she thought his father was a predator. "We were pawns," she said, the words tasting like copper. "You in your palace, and me in my mountains. They stole 10 years of our lives, Ji-hoon. They stole June's childhood. They let us rot in our own versions of hell just to keep their seats at the table." Ji-hoon reached across the table. He didn't grab her hand. He simply laid his palm open, an invitation. "I came here to find you," he said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, quiet clarity. "But looking at these papers, looking at what they did to us, I realized I didn't just come to find you. I came to find a reason to finish it." He looked toward the room where June slept. "The Vipers think they've won because the time has passed," Ji-hoon whispered. "They think the stain is gone. They don't realize that the ink is permanent, and they don't know that the boy with the Han eyes is waiting." Mia looked at the black ledger, then at the man she had once called the Sheath. She didn't take his hand yet, but she didn't pull away. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Ji-hoon stood up, the light from the kitchen lamp casting his shadow, long and sharp, against the wall. "I'm going to go back to Seoul," he said, "and I'm going to show them exactly what happens when you try to bury the truth in a mountain. I'm going to take everything from them, Mia. Not for the empire, not for the name, for the 9 years they took from my son." The glass-walled monolith of the Han Group headquarters pierced the Seoul skyline like a silver needle, but on the 34th floor, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of old wood, expensive tobacco, and impending doom. Director Shin sat at the head of the obsidian conference table, his fingers steepled. Around him sat the Council of Elders, men whose hair was white as bone and whose fortunes were built on the foundations of the city's shadows. They were restless. The living ghost had been absent for 3 days, and rumors of his rural excursion had begun to leak through the cracks of the syndicate. "The chairman is unwell," Shin said, his voice a smooth, practiced lie. "His obsession with the past has finally compromised his judgment. It is time we discuss a transition of—" The heavy oak doors didn't open. They were thrown wide. Ji-hoon walked in. He wasn't wearing the windbreaker from the village. He was dressed in a suit of charcoal silk, his shirt bleached white, his tie a sharp, bloody crimson. He didn't look like a ghost. He looked like a god of war who had remembered his name. He didn't take his seat. He walked to the center of the room, trailed by Mr. Park, who carried a slim silver briefcase. "Continue, Shin," Ji-hoon said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that made the water in the glasses on the table tremble. "I'm curious to hear how you plan to manage a transition for a man who is standing right in front of you." Shin's face paled, but he held his ground. "Chairman, you've been distracted. The Kang merger." "The Kang merger was a fiction," Ji-hoon interrupted. He signaled to Park. The wall-sized monitor behind the table flickered to life. It didn't show stock prices or shipping manifests. It showed the black ledger. The elders leaned in. They saw the offshore accounts. They saw the diverted millions. They saw the payments to the private investigators who had been paid to lie to their boss for a decade. But most damning of all, a recording began to play, lo-fi, but unmistakable. "Let him hate the woman he loved. Hate is a better motivator than grief." The voice was Madame Kang's, but the response was Shin's. "I've handled the airport manifest, Madame. He'll never look for her in Korea. He'll be chasing ghosts in the States until he dies." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a vacuum before an explosion. Ji-hoon walked slowly toward Shin. Every step was a sentence of death. He didn't pull a gun. He didn't reach for a blade. He simply leaned over the table, his hands flat on the obsidian surface, his Han-style eyes locked onto Shin's. "You didn't just steal my money, Shin," Ji-hoon whispered, the sound carrying to every corner of the room. "You stole 9 years of my son's life. You turned the woman I love into a fugitive in her own heart." "I did it for the family," Shin shrieked, his composure finally shattering. "She made you weak. You were going to leave us for a—" "She didn't make me weak," Ji-hoon said, standing tall. "She made me human. And you made me the monster you were always afraid of." Ji-hoon turned to the elders. "Director Shin is stripped of his rank. His assets are frozen. His name is erased from the Han registry. He is gone nothing." The elders, seeing the shift in the wind, bowed their heads as one. In the underworld, a man without a name was a man already dead. 2 security guards, men who had once bowed to Shin, stepped forward. They didn't escort him out. They grabbed him by the elbows and dragged him. Shin's heels scuffed against the polished marble as he begged, his cries echoing down the hallway. They took him to the service elevator, down to the loading docks, and literally threw him onto the rain-slicked pavement of the alleyway. Shin landed in a puddle, his $4,000 suit soaking up the city's filth. Ji-hoon stood at the edge of the dock, looking down at the man who had been his mentor and his betrayer. He didn't fire a bullet. He didn't need to. In the distance, the black sedans of the Kang family, the people Shin had used as a shield, were already pulling into the alley. They didn't like being used as pawns, and they were coming for their pound of flesh. "The street is yours, Shin," Ji-hoon said, his voice cold and final. "Try to find your peace there." Ji-hoon turned back to the building. He had cleared the thorns. Now he had to go back to the mountain and see if the soil would still have him. The black sedan that carried Madame Kang into the valley of Haho did not feel like a vessel of royalty. It felt like a tumbril. Ji-hoon sat in the front seat, silent, his gaze fixed on the winding mountain road. In the back, his mother sat shrouded in Dior silk and a lifetime of unyielding pride. She had not spoken since they crossed the provincial line. She had assumed this excursion would be a fleeting gesture, a brief, distasteful apology, followed by a swift retrieval of the Han air. "We are here," Ji-hoon said, as the car came to a halt at the edge of the village. He didn't open her door. He waited for her to step out into the dust herself. When she did, her handmade Italian leather heels sank into the soft, unpaved earth. The smell of manure and wood smoke hit her like an insult. "You expect me to walk?" she asked, her voice a thin, crystalline blade. "I expect you to earn your way to the door," Ji-hoon replied. They walked the final half-mile to Mia's cottage. By the time they arrived, the hem of the mother's skirt was stained with red clay. She stood before the humble wooden gate, her eyes scanning the thatched roof and the vegetable patches with a visceral shudder of disgust. Mia was at the well. She didn't drop her bucket. She didn't bow. She didn't even acknowledge the woman who had tried to erase her from existence. She simply hauled the water, turned her back, and walked into the house. "She will not look at me," Madame Kang hissed, turning to her son. "She is giving you exactly what you gave her for 10 years, Ji-hoon said. "Silence." The first night was a calculated descent. Ji-hoon did not take his mother to a local inn. He led her to the small, drafty outbuilding where Mia had first lived. There was no bed, only a thin, hemp-woven mat on the floor. There was no climate control, only the damp, persistent chill of the mountain night. For dinner, Mia placed a single tray on the porch. There was no grilled galbi, no refined side dishes of the capital. There was a bowl of coarse barley rice, a mound of pungent, over-fermented kimchi, and a cup of bitter mountain tea. Poor man's food, the kind of meal the mother hadn't touched since the Korean War. "I cannot eat this," the mother said, staring at the tray as if it were a bowl of stones. "Then you will be hungry." Mia's voice drifted from inside the main house, cold and clinical. It was the first time she had spoken, but she did not emerge. Madame Kang sat on the floor, her joints aching, her pride screaming. She looked at the barley. She looked at the shadows of the village. For 70 years, she had ruled from a throne of marble. Now, she was being reduced to the soil she had mocked. The second day was worse. Mia continued her silence of the mountain. She moved through the yard, teaching a small group of children on the porch, ignoring the matriarch who sat like a discarded doll in the outbuilding. Madame Kang watched through the window. She saw June. She saw the way the boy moved, the exact terrifyingly familiar tilt of his head. She saw her late husband's eyes in a child who was currently barefoot, chasing a chicken near the fence. The sight of her bloodline diluted by the dirt of the valley was an agony she hadn't prepared for. She tried to approach the boy during his break. "Come here, child," she commanded, her voice regaining a sliver of its soul authority. "Do you know who I am?" June stopped. He looked at her with a gaze so piercingly intelligent it made her breath catch. "You're the woman who made my mother cry in her sleep," he said softly. He didn't wait for her response. He turned and ran back to Mia, who caught him in an embrace that was a deliberate wall between the boy and the grandmother. By the third day, the mother was broken. The cold had seeped into her bones. The barley had become her only sustenance. The silence of Mia, that absolute crushing refusal to be seen or heard, had stripped away the matriarch's last layers of armor. She realized that in this valley her money was paper and her name was a ghost. On the evening of the third day, Madame Kang did something she had not done in 40 years. She didn't summon. She didn't command. She walked to Mia's front door. She didn't bow. Her pride wouldn't allow that yet. But she sat on the hard wood of the porch, her head bowed. "The rice is bitter," she whispered, her voice cracking. "But the silence is worse. Speak to me, Mia. Tell me what I have to do to see my grandson's face without him fearing me." The sliding door creaked open. Mia stood there, silhouetted by the warm light of a kerosene lamp. She looked down at the woman who had tried to destroy her, and for the first time in 3 days, she looked her directly in the eye. "You don't start with him," Mia said, her voice a low, heavy vibration. "You start with the dirt. Pick up the broom, Madame Kang. The porch is lived in, and it needs to be cleaned." Ji-hoon, watching from the shadows of the gate, felt a shiver of awe. He saw his mother, the queen of the Han, slowly reach for the straw broom. The humiliation was complete, but the restoration was beginning in the only way it could, from the ground up. The morning mist clung to the thatch of the cottage like a damp shroud, but the air inside was sharp with the scent of pine needles and unsaid things. Madame Kang sat on the edge of the wooden porch, her Dior suit now wrinkled and stained with the dust of the valley, watching June. The boy was sitting in the dirt, but he wasn't playing. He had a series of smooth river stones laid out in a complex grid, a Barduk problem he had memorized from one of the village elders. His small hand hovered over the board, his brow furrowed in a concentration so intense it looked like a physical weight. Madame Kang watched his fingers. They moved with a predatory grace. He wasn't just placing stones. He was closing traps that hadn't even been set yet. "You have the Han hands," she said, her voice sounding thin in the vast mountain silence. June didn't look up. "I have my mother's hands. She taught me how to hold a pen before I held a stone." The mother felt a surge of something she hadn't felt in decades. Genuine, unadulterated greed. Not for money, but for the future. She saw in this boy the salvation of the Han line, a brilliance that could bridge the gap between the underworld and the legitimate world. She reached into her silk handbag and pulled out a small velvet-lined box. Inside was a signet ring, heavy gold topped with a deep red jade. It was the seal of the chairman's heir. "June, she whispered, leaning closer. "This village is a cage for a mind like yours. In Seoul, I have teachers who can speak 7 languages. I have libraries that would take you a lifetime to read. I have a throne waiting for a king who is smart enough to take it." She pushed the box toward him across the dirt. "This is yours. Everything I own is yours. You only have to come with me. Your mother. She will be well looked after. But you belong to the world." June finally looked at her. His Han-style eyes were flat, cold and devastatingly clear. He looked at the gold ring as if it were a piece of common gravel. "You think everything has a price because you've never earned anything that wasn't paid for," June said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of the mountains behind him. He picked up the gold ring and handed it back to her. "My mother didn't buy me clothes with your money. She didn't feed me with your name. She bled for every bowl of rice I ever ate. I am not a Han heir. I am my mother's son first, and her son doesn't go where she is only a visitor." He stood up, dusting his knees with a finality that made Madame Kang feel smaller than the stones on the ground. He walked into the house without looking back. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Mia's steady footsteps. She had been standing in the doorway, her arms crossed, her eyes fixed on the matriarch. Madame Kang looked at the ring in her palm. The gold felt cold. For 70 years, she had believed that the family was a temple, and she was its high priestess. She had lied, betrayed, and destroyed in the name of the bloodline. But looking at the empty space where her grandson had stood, she realized she had built a temple with no gods inside. She stood up, her joints popping. She didn't look at Ji-hoon, who was watching from the gate. She looked at Mia. "I told myself I did it for him," the mother whispered, her voice finally breaking, the jagged edges of her pride dissolving into a raw human grief. "I told myself I was protecting my son from a world that would eat him alive if he was soft. But I wasn't protecting him. I was protecting my own fear of being forgotten." She took a step toward Mia. She didn't bow. She simply lowered her head, her silver hair catching the morning light. "I am sorry, Mia," she said. The words were quiet, stripped of the madame and the han. "Not because you are the mother of the heir, not because the family needs you. I am sorry because I'm an old woman who realized too late that I spent my life killing the only things that were actually alive." Mia watched her. She saw the tremble in the older woman's hands. She didn't offer a hug. That would be a lie. But she reached out and placed a hand on the mother's shoulder, a brief, heavy acknowledgement of the truth. "The dirt is hard to wash off, madame," Mia said softly, "but the rain is coming." Ji-hoon walked forward, taking his mother's arm. She didn't resist. She leaned into him, her stature finally matching her age. The queen was gone. Only a grandmother remained, standing in the dust of a village that had taught her how to finally see. The purge of Director Shin was merely the pruning of a dead branch. The cleaning of the house was the tilling of the soil itself. Ji-hoon returned to Seoul not as a conqueror, but as an architect of obsolescence. He moved through the glass corridors of the Han Group with a terrifying, quiet efficiency. He didn't fire bullets. He fired accountants. He didn't break bones. He dissolved contracts. "The shipyard in Busan," Ji-hoon said, his voice echoing in the marble boardroom. He tossed a thick stack of legal filings onto the table. "Effective immediately, the holding company is dissolved. The land will be deeded to the city for a vocational maritime college. The security fees we've been collecting from the local vendors, those are now scholarships." The remaining elders stared at him, their faces pale. "Chairman," one stammered, "that shipyard represents 30% of our liquid laundering." "It represents a debt," Ji-hoon interrupted, his eyes flashing with the cold light of a man who had seen the bottom of his own soul. "A debt I am tired of carrying. Every front company, every shell corporation, every import-export business that deals in shadows, it all goes. We are moving into the light, or we are moving into the ground. Choose." Under the watchful, now humbled eye of Mr. Park, the Han Empire began to mutate. The construction unions that had once been used to strong-arm rivals were transformed into the June Foundation for Rural Education. The nightclubs that served as backdrops for illicit deals were sold off. The proceeds funneled into a national network of shelters for displaced women, the very women the organization had once overlooked. Ji-hoon was dismantling the machine that had fed his family for 3 generations. He was making himself a man of modest means and immense, quiet legacy. While the lawyers in Seoul scrambled to keep up with his frantic pace of redemption, Ji-hoon's heart remained 3 hours south. He arrived in Haho on a Saturday, driving himself in a dusty, reliable SUV that looked like it belonged to a local school administrator. He didn't go to Mia's door first. He went to the small, overgrown plot of land directly adjacent to her cottage. The property was a wild tangle of briars and ancient, gnarled plum trees. It had been empty for 20 years, a gap in the village's teeth. Ji-hoon stood in the center of the tall grass, the mountain wind tugging at his hair. He looked at the low stone wall that separated this land from Mia's garden. "It's a lot of work, Mr. Han," a voice said from over the wall. Mia was standing there, a pair of gardening shears in her hand. She looked at him, not with the knife-edged suspicion of their first reunion, but with a guarded, softening curiosity. "I've spent so many years destroying things, Mia," Ji-hoon said, walking toward the wall. I think I'm ready to learn how to fix a fence. You bought it? She asked, gesturing to the overgrown lot. I did. The papers are signed. I'm not asking to move into your house. I know I haven't earned that door yet, but I'd like to be the neighbor who helps you carry the coal this winter. I'd like to be the man who watches the sunset from the porch next to yours. Mia looked at the land, then back at him. She saw the man who had bared his back to her, the man who had broken his own mother's pride, and the man who was currently liquidating a billion-dollar empire to be worthy of a village school teacher. The plum trees are dying, she observed, her voice low. They haven't been pruned in a generation. Then show me where to start, Ji-hoon said. He reached over the wall, and this time Mia didn't pull away. She handed him the shears. It wasn't a coronation. It was a job. And as Ji-hoon made the first cut into the dead wood, he felt the weight of the chairman finally begin to fall away, replaced by the simple, heavy reality of the earth. The village of Haho was asleep. The only sound was the rhythmic ghoul-ghoul of the river and the distant hoot of an owl. Mia stepped out onto her porch to pull in the drying herbs, only to find Ji-hoon sitting on the steps of his own cottage, staring at the moon. He stood up when he saw her. He didn't approach. He waited for the silent invitation of her nod. He walked to the low stone wall and stepped over it, a gesture that had become a nightly ritual. They sat together on her porch, their shoulders nearly touching. June asked me today if I was ever going to move back to the city, Ji-hoon said quietly. And what did you tell him? I told him that the city is full of mirrors, but the mountain is the only place I can see my own face. He turned to her, the moonlight catching the silver at his temples. I spent 10 years thinking that if I found you, I'd take you back to my empire. I was so arrogant, Mia. I thought my power was the only thing that could protect you. Mia looked at his hands, calloused now from the school repairs, the knuckles no longer bruised from fights, but stained with cedar oil. She reached out, her fingers sliding into his palm. You didn't find me to take me back, she said. You found me so you could find yourself. Ji-hoon leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. It wasn't the desperate volcanic kiss of their path. It was something much more terrifying and beautiful. It was recognition. I've spent the past months watching you, he whispered. I've watched you heal this village. I've watched you raise a boy who is better than I will ever be. I don't want to be your sheath anymore, Mia. I just want to be the man who grows old in your garden. Mia closed the final inch of distance. The kiss tasted of the mountain air and the long, hard-earned peace of two survivors. When they finally pulled apart, Mia took his hand and led him inside. Not as a guest, not as a boss, but as the man who had finally earned the door. The air in the Haho Valley had turned to liquid gold. It was the day of the mass dance festival, an ancient rite where the villagers donned wooden faces to satirize the powerful and celebrate the persistent. But this year, the most talked about transformation wasn't on the stage. It was at the village schoolhouse. Ji-hoon stood on a rickety wooden ladder, a hammer tucked into the waistband of his faded denim work pants. He was no longer the living ghost in charcoal silk. His skin had been deepened by a year of mountain sun, and his hands, once used to signing death warrants and corporate takeovers, were covered in the honest white dust of drywall and cedar shavings. Higher on the left, Mr. Han, a young voice chirped from below. Ji-hoon looked down. A group of third graders, the very children he once would have considered invisible, were holding the base of his ladder. He adjusted the welcome to the festival banner with a careful, practiced hand. Is this sufficient, directors? Ji-hoon asked, a rare, genuine spark of humor in his Han-style eyes. The children giggled, unaware that the man fixing their roof had once commanded an army of shadows. To them, he was simply the new assistant, the quiet man who lived in the cottage next to teacher Mia, the one who fixed the broken desks and taught the older boys how to play baruk with a terrifying, silent brilliance. Mia emerged from the schoolhouse, her hair wrapped in a vibrant silk scarf that caught the light. She stopped at the foot of the ladder, looking up at him. The tension that had defined their reunion had long since evaporated, replaced by a steady, comfortable heat, the kind of warmth that only comes from a fire that has been carefully tended through a long winter. "The principal says the stage is ready," Mia said, her voice a soft melody against the backdrop of festival flutes, "and June is waiting for a sparring partner." Ji-hoon climbed down, his movements lithe and unburdened. He wiped his dusty hands on a rag and looked at her. He didn't say he loved her. He didn't have to. The way he stepped into her space, his shoulder brushing hers with a familiar, easy gravity, said everything the ink on his back already knew. They walked together toward the village square. June was there, sitting on a stone bench, surrounded by the village elders. The boy was 10 now, taller, his gaze still sharp but no longer haunted. He looked at his father, the man who had traded an empire for a hammer, and gave a sharp, decisive nod. "The opening move is yours, father," June said, gesturing to the stones. Ji-hoon sat. As he leaned forward to place his stone, the collar of his simple linen shirt fell back. For a brief second, the edge of the tattoo was visible to the crowd, the dark, intricate lines of a woman's jawline etched into his very being. A few of the elders whispered, sensing the history hidden beneath the skin of their assistant, but Ji-hoon didn't hide it. He didn't need a sheath anymore. The sun began its slow descent, bleeding crimson and violet over the peaks of the Sobek Mountains. The festival fires were being lit, their smoke curling toward the stars like prayers. Above the tiled roofs of Haho, on one side lies the village, a cluster of ancient hanoks, a testament to survival and tradition. On the other side lie the mountains, vast, indifferent, and protective. In the center, 3 figures walk away from the noise of the celebration. Mia is in the middle, her hand resting on June's shoulder. Ji-hoon walks beside them, his hand occasionally reaching out to steady her on the uneven path. They aren't running. They aren't hiding. They are simply walking home. The distance is gone. The lies are ash. There is only the long, quiet walk into the evening. The industrial basement in Seongsudong was as sterile and silent as it had been a decade ago. Master O, his hands perhaps a bit more tremulous, but his eyes still sharp as needles, looked at the man sitting on his table. Ji-hoon had his back turned. The portrait of Mia was a masterpiece of aged ink, a part of his anatomy now. "You want to add to it?" Master O asked, his voice a raspy rasp. "Most men your age are trying to laser them off, Ji-hoon." "I am not most men," Ji-hoon replied, "and this story isn't finished." He pointed to the space right above the portrait's shoulder, near the base of his neck. There, a mugunghwa, the rose of Sharon, in full bloom. The artist looked at the sketch, a delicate, resilient flower that thrives even in the harshest soils, known in Korea as the eternal flower. He looked at the scars on Ji-hoon's shoulders and the new, peaceful clarity in his gaze. "Why the flower, Chairman? You've already given her your whole back." Ji-hoon felt the first sting of the needle, a familiar, grounding pain. He closed his eyes, seeing the river in Haho and the woman waiting for him on the porch. "Because the portrait was about love," Ji-hoon whispered as the pink ink began to bloom on his skin. "But the flower is because the roots are finally deep enough." The wedding was not a state affair. There were no black-tied directors or flashing paparazzi bulbs. It took place in the central courtyard of the Haho village, under the ancient sprawling branches of the 600-year-old Zelkova tree. Mia stood in the center of the square, a vision of cross-cultural elegance. She wore a bespoke hanbok made of heavy cream-colored raw silk, but the bodice was embroidered with intricate West African patterns in gold thread, a nod to the ancestors she carried with her. She looked like a queen of two worlds. Ji-hoon stood opposite her, dressed in a traditional dark blue gwanbok. He looked steady, his feet planted firmly on the earth he had spent a year tilling. The village matriarch, Halmony, presided, her voice cracking with a rare, grudging tenderness. In the city, Halmony began, they sign papers to own each other. Here, we look at the trees. A tree doesn't ask the mountain for permission to grow. It simply digs its roots until the wind can't move it. These two, they have been through the storm. They have been uprooted. But today, they graft themselves together. June stood between them as the ring bearer, but he didn't carry velvet cushions. He carried a small ceramic bowl filled with soil from the village and a small pouch of sea salt from the coast. Ji-hoon took Mia's hand. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked only at her. I spent my life marking my skin to remember who I loved, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But today, I mark my life. I don't give you a name or a title. I give you the rest of my days, the strength of my back, and the silence of my heart. Mia squeezed his hand, her eyes shimmering. I didn't need a savior, Ji-hoon. I needed a partner. You walked through the fire to find this village, and I walked through the ice to keep our son safe. Today, we stop walking alone. They didn't just exchange rings. Following an old village custom Mia had requested to modify, they both poured their separate containers of soil into a single large pot containing a sapling. A rose of Sharon. Together, they whispered. As they kissed, the village broke into a roar of cheers. The drums of the masked dancers began to beat, a rhythmic primal sound that echoed off the mountain walls. Later that night, after the village had quieted and the last of the festival lanterns had flickered out, they sat on the porch of their combined cottage. The wall between the two properties had been torn down, replaced by a shared garden. The moon was high, silvering the mountains. Ji-hoon sat behind Mia, his arms wrapped around her waist. You're finally a Han, he teased softly, kissing her temple. No, Mia corrected, turning in his arms to look at him. You're finally a person. The Han is just a name. This, she touched his chest over his heart. This is the man I married. Ji-hoon slowly unbuttoned his traditional robe, letting the heavy fabric fall to his waist. He turned his back to her, exposing the masterpiece of ink. In the moonlight, the new rose of Sharon tattoo next to her portrait seemed to glow. It's complete now, he said. Mia leaned forward, pressing a soft kiss to the blooming flower on his skin, then to the inked portrait of her own face. It was the ultimate intimacy, the woman in the flesh kissing the woman in the ink, a bridge across 10 years of pain. We aren't ghosts anymore, Ji-hoon, she whispered. No, he replied, turning back to pull her into the warmth of the house. We are the roots. He searched the world for her. She was 3 hours away. Some love stories aren't about the distance. They're about the lies that keep you apart and the truth that brings you home. The end. Thank you for watching. If you love this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more emotional twists and character-driven plots. And if you're ready for the next story, make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Until next time, keep believing in love that defies all odds.